Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. If you enjoy the materials we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of the videos on YouTube. Just as the rise of radio as a medium in the 1930s ran in parallel with the ascendancy of Nazism, so in the 21st century, the rise of the internet is accompanied by an unprecedented level of discord, division, and coercion since the Second World War. Joseph Goebbels saw radio as a new wonder weapon when combined with the emerging disciplines of behavioral psychology and social science. Today, I'm talking with Carl Miller about the death of the 20th century's propaganda weapons and the creation of new ones for the 21st century. Carl Miller is an experienced digital researcher, author, and international speaker. He's a partner and research director at CASM Technology, visiting fellow at King's, and an international speaker in great demand. He is also author of the fascinating book, The Death of the Gods, the New Global Power Grab. Carl is interested in how technology is changing society and politics. In 2012, he co-founded the first UK think tank institute dedicated to studying the digital world at Demos, and has been its research director ever since. He writes widely on tech and society, including for The Economist, Wired, New Scientist, Sunday Times, Telegraph, and The Guardian. Carl, it's a great experience to talk to you.
Hi there, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Good. Well, I'm going to jump straight in there, and let's start on a provocative note. You've written extensively about the industrialisation of disinformation that took place during the COVID pandemic, and how seemingly disconnected websites and voices coalesced into a movement fueling hyper-partisan politics and discontent. Can you describe the process of how conspiracy theories like this become weaponized?
Yeah, so it's a good place to start, Jonathan. It was early, it kind of began, my window into that kind of emerged in the kind of early months of the pandemic. It was a kind of mixed investigation, actually, with both the BBC and also colleagues of mine at CASM and elsewhere kind of building technology to actually try and study and keep track of all of this. And kind of one of the hypotheses that we had, I suppose, was that, you know, as the pandemic was changing everything, it was also going to cause this kind of some form of important pivot in how the far right and extremist mobilizations online were going to both work, the pitches they were going to make, the outreaches that we're going to do. So we kind of tracked all of that and collected millions of messages, mainly from Facebook, but also Twitter and Telegram. And basically, to cut a very long story short, what we saw emerging was a kind of strange new kind of interaction between kind of extremist politics and kind of alt health sites. So, you know, groups which were kind of predominantly talking about race, about migration, and about elites. It's always about elites at some level. They kind of started also to talk about pandemic, about vaccines, about kind of social and governmental control. And that was, and in doing so, they actually also then began to form these like strange new alliances with a whole strange network of websites, predominantly websites, but with social media presence as well. They were kind of trenchantly anti-vaccine, and had kind of built this whole kind of alternative and parallel world, which kind of rejected, I guess, many of the kind of mainstays of kind of conventional mainstream medical science.
And do you think this sucked in a lot of people who wouldn't normally have formed part of this conspiracy network? Is it a way of expanding their audience?
Yeah, that's right. And that was a big fear, really, was that, you know, everyone, both kind of psychologically and sociologically, it felt like the pandemic was a moment of great danger when it came to radicalization and extremism and conspiracy theories. There you've got lots of people very afraid, trying to cope with a world full of uncertainties, you know, probably starker uncertainties at that point, about what the future was going to look like, what the virus was really about, how government should respond than I think I can remember in my lifetime. And also with tons of time on their hands. You know, so we saw there's loads of evidence about how people kind of leaning more and more on the digital world, you know, spending more time browsing, more time learning about the world through the internet than at any other point. And those all those things kind of mixed together form a kind of heady brew, really, in terms of people's vulnerability. So yes, I'm afraid that I think in that moment, lots of people suddenly found themselves like being immersed into these worlds which were very, very different from the mainstream, which actually kind of in a strange way took them out of their kind of familial and social contexts. Like I throughout the whole of the pandemic, I was being messaged by people all the time who were talking about family members that they were losing to conspiracy theory.
And that's a really interesting point to come in there. I was speaking to Jessica Aro recently about this, and she pointed out that Russia played a fairly active role in not necessarily seeding these conspiracy theories, but in throwing petrol on the flames and trying to amplify them. But I think it also shows that there is some collateral damage from weaponizing these conspiracy theories. For instance, the uptake of COVID vaccines, especially in Russia, says a lot about the distrust people have of the state. But also that distrust around vaccines was fired up by the Kremlin's own propaganda designed to not just discredit Western science, but discredit Western modes of government as well.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think there's, at least until the invasion of Ukraine, because I think that moment actually probably precipitated an important shift in the kinds of influence operations we were seeing, their targets and likely like kind of causes or motives. But at least until that point, there was this kind of very healthy, sometimes quite fiery debate amongst researchers like me around like what really is Russia or China or any kind of state-based influence operation targeting the West really trying to do? Like, what is the ultimate end game? And I guess like one of the consensuses which emerged was exactly as you said, really, the kind of focus on issues like conspiracy theories, really wedge issues to do with trust of experts, and wedge issues to do with kind of culture wars or important kind of social cleavages, and use all of that to really try and propel kind of polarization forwards. Conspiracy theories are a great way of doing that. If you want to kind of diminish the capacity for the adversary's government to kind of be able to direct citizens in one way or another via persuasion, draining the trust of a citizenry in their government is a brilliant way of doing that. And conspiracy theories, probably more than anything else, are the best tool.
I've had quite a few arguments with sort of friends and colleagues, especially those who are perhaps left-leaning, or even right-leaning, mostly left-leaning, who tend to sort of explore some of these topics around conspiracy. And they often ask me, well, what's Russia's aim? What do they benefit from potentially amplifying these conspiracy theories? And obviously they're trying to look at it through almost like a normalization point of view. They're looking at it through some kind of rational or logical lens. Would it be true to say, though, that players like Russia, perhaps not China so much, but Russia is perhaps playing a zero-sum game where anything that weakens its opponent is seen as grist to the mill?
Yes, well, I mean, broadly, yes. I think kind of using kind of information maneuver as a way of kind of reducing, like in their eyes, their enemies' abilities to respond in ways which are effective, say, to a global pandemic is in general definitely, I would say, like one of the kind of strategic mainstays of what they were doing. But probably, I mean, it's important to say about conspiracy theories, by the way, that, and I kind of realized this a long time ago now, almost 10 years ago, I kind of spent a whole year kind of debating with and kind of getting to know actually kind of members, kind of largely London-based members of the 9/11 Truth Movement, actually extremely kind of innocent conspiracy theory community compared to everything that followed. But one thing that really taught me, just, I think in a year of argument and debate, I do not believe that I convinced a single person of that movement that they were wrong, firstly. But secondly, what I really did realize was that this is not just a series of arguments, posited on a series of apparent bases of evidence. It's a social movement. These people are friends with each other. These are identities that they hold. It gives them meaning to be part of this group. I mean, when you become a conspiracy theorist, you're suddenly fighting against a shadowy power that has kind of, benighted a whole civilization, has trapped a whole civilization in its web. And you're one of the few people that can see that. And therefore you have this huge meaning, and direction in your life to actually try and throw off that yoke. And there's jokes. I mean, there's a kind of new authority sources, kind of new experts. And in that sense, I stepped away, kind of really believing, and I'm going to use a kind of unapologetically kind of research a concept here, that there is a kind of parallel epistemological arena which conspiracy theorists build. They build a whole parallel way for knowledge to be acquired, for beliefs to be both kind of defended and validated, which is separate to the mainstream, separate to mainstream experts, separate to mainstream theories of science, separate to mainstream journalism. And that's very powerful. And in a way, that's really what I think we've seen emerge with conspiracy theories. This whole parallel to the mainstream. And yeah, I think autocratic states like Russia and China can see that, of course. And they know that, there are probably opportunities there for them to help that kind of parallel structure along, amplify it, as you said, because ultimately that will form some kind of competitor environment to the mainstream.
Well, I'm going to jump to a question I was going to ask later on, because it seems to be incredibly relevant to this. Let's have a look at that kind of mirror world that's being created through these narratives. And the fact is that these worlds are built up using digital technology. In some ways, they create our algorithmic selves, our digital doppelgangers, who exist in these sort of amplified echo chambers. What are the risks here, as you mentioned, of autocracy, and for this technology to exist in autocracy? I mean, is there going to be a point at which dissent is not possible? A little bit like Minority Report, where a government can actually tell if you're going to be a dissenter before you even know it yourself.
Well, we're still trying to get algorithms to recognize cats, to be honest with you. So I think we've got rather a long way to go before we're able to make those kinds of predictive claims with any degree of non-randomness at all. But I mean, the broader risk is definitely there. I mean, like we've seen, with kind of China in a sophisticated way and Russia in a much cruder way, really how autocratic governments can control the digital world and can rebuild the digital world in ways which are much more suited to kind of centralized forms of control and censorship, for sure. I think that's been one of the kind of big journeys, in the kind of writers and researchers have been on, since Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring to now, is really a kind of 360-degree kind of revolution in going from thinking that the digital world was actually going to be something which was going to throw off autocrats to now, I think, genuinely believing that it probably actually benefits autocratic rule and consolidates the power that they have.
And that's an interesting point when it comes to Russia and China, I think, because Russia doesn't even really have the infrastructure to control VPN use as much as they'd like to. And as you say, it's fairly crude in that it's all about coercion. It's all about negatives rather than any kind of positive, in their view, sort of reinforcement of correct behaviors. Whereas China is developing a social credit system. Do you think that's a sort of a foretaste of far more sophisticated, intrusive systems that are going to come in the future?
I mean, I think it's plenty sophisticated and plenty intrusive as it is. But yes, of course, I mean, they're building a system which essentially will allow them to plug in all kinds of incentives and disincentives to all kinds of behavior, both on in the digital world and off it. So absolutely, and I mean, Russia, for all their desire, I'm sure, to replicate what China's done, just as you said, simply technologically is unable to right now. But hasn't made. I mean, big debate, of course, about exactly how much information about, say, the Ukraine invasion Russians are receiving, and exactly what most Russians think about the invasion. But it looks like they haven't really needed to ban VPNs. Of course, there's going to be a small minority of Russians that will use them to access information, Wikipedia, foreign journalism, and so on around the world. But actually, most Russians, like most of us, probably most of the time, get the information which is easiest for us to acquire. And that is the Russian internet, and that is Russian television.
And I think there's a big demographic split, isn't there? I've seen a lot of interviews, sort of Vox Pops type interviews that are being done in Russia still. And there seems to be a clear demographic split in that the propaganda weapon that's working the best for the regime is very 20th century technology, and that is television. So if you're above 40, and you tend to be perhaps not in one of the larger cities or in Moscow or St. Petersburg, then you're going to more or less buy into the narratives that are being fed to you, no matter how toxic they seem, and illogical at times as well. If you're below 40, I mean, this is a very crude generalization, of course, but if you're below 40 and you get your information from the internet, you are more likely to have a balanced and negative view of the war. I mean, obviously, extrapolating from several dozen interviews seen on video blogs isn't the scientific process, but there does seem to be a broad trend there.
That's right. Although I think it's important to say, of course, that Russia has intervened to try and prevent kind of countervailing, evidence about the war appearing in the internet as well. So, most Russians, say, wouldn't be actually on Twitter or on Facebook now. They will be on VK and TikTok, and really in most of the social media platforms that now operate in Russia, Russia's leaned very heavily on them to kind of allow all kinds of filtering and censorship to happen, to kind of clean out kind of information, even describing it as a war, for instance, I mean, let alone painting any kind of picture about the true scale of casualties, Russian military incompetence, and so on.
Absolutely. I spoke to an interesting guy a couple of weeks ago called Rob Blackie, and he's been crowdfunding adverts to a Russian audience, which show pictures of the war and point towards independent news sources like Meduza. And I think what he found is that with the programmatic, say, display platforms, I mean, he wouldn't give me the details of exactly which campaign networks and tactics he was using, because it's a constantly evolving struggle. But he was saying that it is possible to get around the blocking of platforms by getting ads to appear either in-app or in browser ads. The only limit there, of course, is the amount of crowdfunding he could gather to get those ads. So that's one way to get around it. But of course, there's no data as to how effective that might be. You can't get, let's say, conversion data to show how your audience is responding to those ads.
I mean, it's a brilliant idea, and I kind of wish him all the best. I mean, I think we are, I mean, for lots of people in the kind of internet research community, like kind of information freedom operations, working out how to get information into a public, which essentially has had their information space kind of captured and controlled by an autocratic government, it isn't a problem that most of us worked on for any duration of time. I mean, most of us kind of look more at the kind of like consequences and perils of free and open platforms rather than try and work out what happens when they go away. So this is a whole new problem set that I'm sure we're going to have to be working on and thinking about for many, many years now.
And are governments doing enough to explore this and potentially invest in countering Russian propaganda? What more could they be doing at this time, at this early stage of the evolution of these techniques? And what should they be doing in the context of the Ukraine war?
It's a great question. Probably one I think about more than anything else at the moment. So much to say about all of this. Firstly, I think it's important to say, at least in my view, most of the pro-invasion propaganda and kind of influence operations that are happening really isn't targeting the West. It's not targeting the UK or the US or even Ukraine. It's targeting the global South. In-play countries, I guess, in the view of the Russian propagandists, would be Brazil and India, and of course China and South Africa, and kind of swathe of African countries who didn't actually join the sanctions regime or even necessarily condemn the invasion when it happened. So our research looked into that. We looked at one of the first kind of pro-invasion kind of operations to happen, quite a crude and simple one, kind of making a couple of pro-invasion hashtags trend on the day of the UN vote. And almost all the accounts that were kind of heavily participating in pumping these hashtags were not Western. They were largely Indian, actually, some South African, Malaysian, Singaporean, Iranian and Pakistani accounts as well. So that's the first thing to say, is that thinking about how to counter this, really what we're having to think about is how to counter kind of a whole series of messaging and techniques which are really trying to portray the invasion as an anti-colonial gesture forced upon Russia as a result of Western aggression, expansionism, and hypocrisy. How to counter it is, I would say, kind of probably like one of the most live questions that we're currently trying to deal with. One which I think almost everyone has wrong. So there's been two main kind of solutions proffered to respond to disinformation and influence operations, digital literacy and kind of platform regulation, neither of which really work. You can't really upskill a whole population to kind of recognize a kind of rapidly changing tradecraft, in my view. And you also can't just rely on platform regulation, because that really means just platforms taking stuff down, which is costless and riskless. They just, like, the people that do these kind of campaigns just price that in. They just set up some more accounts. We have to find ways of putting more pressure and levying more cost and risk on the actors that do these kinds of illicit influence campaigns outside of the platforms. And inevitably, I think that has to be asymmetric. It's very understandable, this kind of notion that we should respond to information warfare with more information warfare, but I ultimately think that is a kind of a losing strategy for the West.
I've read you, I think, in one of your Twitter comments that was leapt upon by a whole bunch of people, and I think you made that point that the aggressive adoption of information warfare by the West won't be effective at countering that Russian propaganda, i.e. aimed at the global South, and especially the internal propaganda, which is almost untouchable. I mean, what are the best strategies and tactics for countering weaponized conspiracy theories and this form of toxic propaganda?
That's right. Well, just before I go into that, perhaps I'll just briefly spell out why I think it won't work. So, because there's two kind of linked reasons, really, I think, for why it won't. Firstly, you don't fight these kinds of illicit influence operations with the truth. The truth alone doesn't work. And the reason for that is that the disinformation is not principally what we're struggling against. We don't have brilliant vocab actually yet to describe the shadowy world of illicit influence, but it's a tradecraft, that encompasses everything from, manipulating search engines through to exploiting identity and kind of harnessing outrage. You mentioned at the very beginning, the kind of this joining of mass media with social science and behavioral science. That's exactly what's happening here. That is the crux, the core of how that tradecraft is developing. But anyone who's a behavioral scientist or a social scientist will tell you that human beings are lazy, habit-prone, with all kinds of cognitive biases, and really aren't rational actors in any sense at all. But disinformation, is the way in which we're describing this problem, which I think is overly rationalist, because really what that sets the problem up to be is, here I am moving around, browsing on the internet, minding my business, and then someone lies to me, and I then change my view of the world as a result of that lie. That's if you pull these campaigns apart, that's absolutely not what happens. Like, what happens is that I'm browsing around on the internet, and someone who is pretending to be an identity which I would talk to, believe, consider myself to be part of, tells me something I already think is true about the world, which I then agree with, and become usually angry about, and then that person then tries to guide that anger and that mobilization in a particular direction. That's how influence operations work. Now, it's a lie in the sense that it's shadowy and involves all kinds of manipulations to do with the platforms, the internet, the messaging, the identities involved, and so on. It's not truthful, but lying is, on the content level, is only one of the ways in which that manipulation happened. As I said, not even I think the most important way. So responding to, how do you respond to that? Well, I mean, the first thing you then have to realize is that simply debunking or putting out the truth to the lie doesn't work when we're dealing with identity and emotion, and that simply, actually, in terms of the illicit manipulation in the first place, simply amplifying some truths over others. So if you can't just debunk the disinformation, then governments, if they were to respond in the information space, have to actually then do the same techniques as the illicit influence in the first place. And I think that is a very, very bad idea, because the one thing that we rely on really in Western liberal democracies are, reasonably open information spaces that people trust and believe in. We need journalism, we need Wikipedia, we need the internet to be places where, populaces go to and broadly become more informed about the world. And if our own governments begin to participate in those kinds of shadowy techniques, then that is for sure going to drain trust and people's engagement with those information spaces. So anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a meander, but I do think it's important to lay out why I've kind of begun to urge governments and all of us to think about kind of asymmetric, non-informational response to information warfare.
And I think that gets to the heart of the problem, though, doesn't it? Because everything else really stems from that and how you deal with that. And to an extent, as you say, it's a little bit like dare I say, an online purchase. You don't just see an ad and immediately go and buy something. You may have dozens of different touch points on various platforms that reinforce this decision to go and buy a product before you actually go and do it. And I guess it's the same in this instance, that you will see maybe dozens or even hundreds of pieces of information before you get sucked into a particular echo chamber or alternative parallel reality.
Right, exactly. Because as I said, it builds up identity, and identity doesn't, it doesn't happen in a single message. It's something which, we slowly move in and out of these various identities which we carry throughout our lives. So it's really, it's really not even the presence of any particular single campaign probably that's important to respond to, but actually to put more pressure on the actual actors, be that spammers and cyber criminals, governments directly, or actually a kind of growing list of companies that are kind of offering these kinds of services to those governments. Those are the kind of people that we need to put pressure on throughout all the different campaigns that they do. And broadly, the solution, I think, looks like, it has two halves. On the one side, detection. We've got to get better at detecting when these things are happening, and beyond simply the narrow portions of the internet which we currently look for them in. We've over-focused far too much on Twitter and Facebook. Almost all the research on disinformation or online influence kind of it descends from one of those two platforms. We have to look at it. We have to search for these kinds of campaigns in all kinds of information spaces, including, I mentioned it more than once already, but Wikipedia is my big bugbear, has been for years. I don't know why influence operators would muck around on Twitter when Wikipedia is sat right there. The largest compendium of information ever created, available to everyone for free, is a very, very precious resource, but it's also a very vulnerable one, and I'm sure is heavily targeted. So detection is one part of this. We've got to find ways of detecting this also in ways which don't rely on the business models of the tech giant. This should be something that civic society, academics, journalists, and so on do, not something which is something which tech giants disclose to the rest of us. But then response, that's really where the new ideas have to emerge. I think we need to kind of create a whole kind of array, or like phalanx of kind of responses when these kind of campaigns are detected, and that probably has to encompass like far more kind of legal avenues of recourse. whether that's libel or defamation law, consumer rights legislation. I think we do have to look at criminal legislation again, and even like digital sedition and things like that, especially, in circumstances where we have elections and other kind of, singularly kind of poignantly vulnerable events. I do think we have to look at whether criminal law actually protects those enough at the moment. Informational activism. So actually activists going out and probably are either kind of targeting the spaces where these campaigns are being coordinated, or targeting the people that are being targeted, as it were, by the campaigns, and political, diplomatic, economic sanctions or deterrence as well. We have to grow up all of those if we're to respond to this. And then finally, to end this particular rant of mine, we need to clean up the world of spam. We often think that kind of the world of influence operations is simply one of geostrategy, simply this great grand question to do with Russia and the UK and the G7 and the United Nations, but it's as much to do with the grubby world of spam and the companies that kind of offer large numbers of fake accounts, for sale. It's very, very easy. You just have to Google buy retweets to see how accessible that world is of online manipulation. There's all these services which have grown up to allow anyone to really to do it, and we have to do something about that world.
That's very comprehensive, and it's difficult to see how the technology corporations will proactively take that on by themselves. But I'd like to try and link this murky online world to more traditional, let's say, sources of disinformation. And this is things like historical myths, racist tropes, weaponized conspiracies, that in some ways the fuel for the new technologies. And looking recently at an instance where the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, caused a scandal by repeating a debunked anti-Semitic trope about Hitler being Jewish, and of course the Jews being the biggest anti-Semites and ultimately, to blame themselves for the Holocaust. Obviously, all that sort of stuff is complete nonsense. There's a parallel with how they're covering Ukraine as well. It's apparently the Ukrainians bombing themselves and not the Russians doing it. No matter how nonsensical these things are, they do have their roots in very old toxic archetypes that seek to caricature those who are different and demonize minorities. So how is the new digital media using these kind of historical hooks in order to, as you were saying, sort of drag people into this alternative reality?
Well, I mean, I think, firstly, like the way that Russia and China use these historical hooks, or really use conspiracy theories in general, is to exploit the simple logic that it's far easier to share something on social media than it is to either take it down or to debunk it. So, I mean, what we see is this kind of pattern where, conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory, be that biolabs or the protocols of the Elders of Zion, are kind of adopted, kind of amplified, and then dropped very quickly. And if nothing else, what that does is kind of tie up and exhaust the kind of communities of journalists and kind of fact checkers and debunkers who broadly are responsible for trying to protect these information spaces. It's very important to say here, by the way, that the way in which information warfare thinks about information is as a theatre of war. So not as a tool of war, but literally, as a space really, that war happens within. And there's a very kind of singular kind of vocabulary which is often used by kind of information warfare, like theorists and practitioners, around like information maneuver, and capture. It very much, attention is a kind of strange new form of territory in a way, and psychology is a kind of the fundament of strategy, and kind of memes are kind of certain kinds of weapons, and information in general is the maneuver, the space that we maneuver within, and that is an extremely powerful idea, I think. And to me, it really does like demarcate the kind of modern like thinking about information warfare from the many millennia in which it's been used in the past. I do think an important shift has happened. But when you begin to think that, okay, information is a space to maneuver within, information itself becomes only good to basically cause behavioral or attitudinal effects. That's the point of it. So whether it's conspiracy theories, any particular argument, really it's not ever the content itself which is particularly important to information theories. It's the effects that it has. It reminds me actually of another BBC investigation I did a while ago, where we went to Kosovo to interview fake news merchants. You know, these were people that controlled or could access vast digital audiences. You know, and they would just send waves of information out that people would click on, and they'd basically send them to their websites and kind of harvest their eyeballs for money. And I remember kind of going through and challenging one on the content which he was sharing, and he didn't even read it. Like he didn't know what it meant. He didn't care what it meant. Like it was simply information which had already proved to be very clickable, and the only point of it was to get clicks, to harvest clicks. That is, I don't think that person, Bessar, his name was, I don't think Bessar would have thought of that perhaps as information warfare, but that sentiment, that information really is only there to do a certain thing, is I think would be very recognizable to anyone that's now thinking about it.
It's a bit like someone sort of, you know, selling guns and not really caring where they end up. They're just the sort of middleman, as it were. Would it also be true to say that this information warfare, if used in isolation, would not of itself win a conflict, but would typically form part of a spectrum of activities, almost like a sliding scale, going from hacking to espionage, hybrid warfare to sabotage, and finally open hostilities?
Yeah, and I think probably one of the kind of important realizations of the Ukraine war is that kind of conventional warfare is, you know, still a thing and still ultimately decides outcomes, and kind of, you know, hybrid warfare, you know, might be a cloud around it, but actually, you know, ultimately isn't, however metaphorically we might try and extend the idea, the same as actually capturing a city or capturing territory. You know, I think in the pre-invasion age, where we thought that kind of interstate conflicts of the kind we're currently seeing like wouldn't really be happening, I think there was a lot of focus on hybrid warfare as a theatre of war, which was seeing much more activity, was much more dynamic. You know, conventional warfare in a sense was frozen, whereas, you know, hybrid warfare and especially information warfare we saw happening all the time, and that's one of the reasons that militaries kind of were looking at it, especially liberal democracies, I think, because they were trying to think about what to do in an arena which is kind of felt dynamic, and also one where it was kind of less clear to them like how and if they should operate within it. Now I think we have remembered, you know, rightly certainly, that conventional conflict is there, it can happen, and is certainly the kind of trunk that will dictate the outcome here. Information warfare is kind of happening around that. There's often, of course, important interactions though, and, you know, in a sense we see like a different kind of very tactical, specific information warfare, you know, actually happening around the conventional war itself. That's not an area that I'm expert in, but you can definitely see how, say, open source and, you know, the sourcing of locations and images is definitely kind of feeding itself into the kind of tactical picture which both sides, you know, develop and pay attention to.
Absolutely. There does seem to be a revolution happening in that sort of hot warfare as well. Things like sort of crowdsourcing the observation of, you know, enemy armor, etc., and building sort of little chatbot networks to collate that intelligence. So I was speaking to a US military expert last week on this sort of new age warfare. He's a sort of expert in that field on next generation technologies and indeed war narratives. And what he said is that Ukraine war is just a teaser for what's to come, the sort of trailer before the full movie. Is this also true for the kind of hybrid information warfare we're talking about? Is it only just begun?
Gosh, I hope that's a very chastening thought. I hope that's not the case. I'm not sure Russia has the military left for whatever comes after the trailer, if this is indeed just the trailer. But yeah, that's certainly a thought that slightly chills me. It is yeah. I mean, what I always think about is that we're only on the very early foothills of what the tradecraft I've been talking about really might be able to achieve. I think that when we look at, say, patent bots on Twitter, or say diplomats amplifying conspiracy theories, this is all like extremely crude, not particularly sophisticated, well hidden, or necessarily that effective. But if you think about how persuasive technology as a field, for instance, has kind of developed and got so much better at kind of understanding human psychology, the sky is the limit in terms of how information warfare might develop itself. The technologists have become so much better at understanding how psychology and behavioral science affect our use of technology. And the technology itself is developing in ways, I think, which probably are conducive to more powerful information warfare. The theory will get better too. And the people that fight it will become more experienced and will learn. So yes, we're only in the very early foothills of this. And that's probably, to me, like one of the more worrying aspects here is that this kind of like thing that we're struggling against is likely to get continuously improving, which just obviously means we have to as well, and means we have to keep evolving our responses.
And turning to the economics of this new type of warfare, I think you've said somewhere that it is irresistible from the financial perspective. So when you compare the cost of information warfare with the very few penalties that are currently attached to it, and how that stacks up against the high costs of traditional warfare, training human beings, investing in heavy metal, as it were. Now, how compelling is this new form of warfare?
I mean, it's extremely cheap, and media is cheap. I mean, I can't, the exact numbers are no longer at my fingertips, but I remember once working out that the annual budget of RT was about 1.5 F-22 Raptor fighter planes. It's compared to the extravagant kind of budgets which militaries have to buy conventional hardware. Information warfare is kind of trivially easy and straightforward and cheap to do, and that's why I think we struggle still to really build ways of being able to demonstrate whether and in what ways it's actually effective. We still can't really tell. I couldn't really tell you whether one campaign is, in terms of actual ultimately behavior, or attitudinal effects, whether it's more effective than another. For the people that are doing it, I'm not sure they're bothering to pause, because for the kinds of outlays and kind of investments I think that would be required, some teams, small amounts of technology, and a kind of ability to learn over time, I'm not really sure that you would need to have a particularly clear, just, kind of empirical justification. Just kind of keep firing stuff out there and, see whether it works or not. And as I said, it's if someone wants to go out there, I mean, don't get any ideas, please, anyone listening to this, but if you do Google like buy retweets, or Google like search engine manipulation, like it really isn't expensive for people to go and acquire these things, and we're talking hundreds, not even thousands of dollars.
It's a bit like the Facebook engineering mantra, isn't it? Move fast and break things, rather than necessarily stopping to think too much about what you're doing.
Right, but the fear is that the on the response side of this, the UK government and other governments really do need evidence bases in order to justify budgetary spends. So, I mean, I'm asked a lot at kind of events with government, how to demonstrate whether this is creating harm, because that's the only way in which budget would then be released to try and spin up responses to it. And so far, I haven't got an answer to that question. So yes, I think move fast and break things, Facebook's famous adage, is definitely on one side of this equation, but not on both.
So when you do your research, how do you decide which story to follow? How do you source your data, process it, and then try to sort of visualize it to tell, a compelling story?
Well, we'd need at least another full hour, I'm sure, so I could bore everyone senseless with social media research methodology. In a nutshell, we build our own technology. We have done for 10 years now to try and research the internet and social media better. The kind of core at the heart of that technology is a field called NLP, or natural language processing, which is really teaching computers to kind of understand and be able to therefore analyze kind of human language as it happens on social media at scale. With our colleagues at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is a kind of large kind of counter-extremism and counter-disinformation kind of think tank, we've built a kind of capability that's called Beam. And really, that is what we use to detect these influence operations at scale. In a nutshell, the way it really works is it creates a series of analytical avenues that analysts kind of bounce between in order to detect these campaigns and pull them apart. Some analysis happens at the content level, so training NLP algorithms to say recognize narratives and then split them apart. Some happens at what we call the entity level. So this is using named entity recognition to say identify people, places, and organizations present within data. Some happens at the account level, that we would then understand that some accounts are sharing certain narratives, mentioning certain entities in a certain way, and over time we kind of begin to build a profile that kind of, let's say, discriminates them from other accounts. And some happens at the community level, which might have been the visualizations you saw, and that's us then trying to find patterns, behavior, which you can really only see when you zoom out and you watch large numbers of accounts all interacting with each other and behaving in ways which might be signals of coordinated or hidden forms of inauthenticity. And there you go. I mean, it's kind of broadly a method which splits itself. Half of it is kind of broad continuous monitoring. So we'll set this up, say, for the climate disinformation for COP26, and we'll look at certain kinds of language, certain spaces which we think are going to be targeted, and that's a kind of long-running kind of monitoring activity. And then when we see a campaign, we use the same technology in quite a different way, and we kind of use it in a much more bespoke investigatory way as we kind of tunnel into those campaigns, try and collect as much of it as we can, and then try and inch our way towards those kind of precious questions of attribution and strategic intent, the kind of techniques being used, and so on.
That's fascinating, and I'm sure there's a vast amount of detail that could be unpacked there, and a vast amount of data, I imagine, as well. You probably work with pretty powerful machines to mine that data.
Lots of algorithmic work. I mean, not me, but I'm blessed to have many colleagues who are absolutely brilliant machine learning researchers. So yeah, that is the way of handling the kind of large amounts of data that we need to. For anyone who is interested, of course, in technology and how it works, we've actually got a new young website, CASMtechnology.com, where we write a bit more about how we do this kind of work. So please, anyone that's listening to this, do visit there if you're interested in learning more.
I had a flick through that last night, and I can highly recommend it. There's a huge variety of different stories there, but all with very large sort of data insights at its heart and brilliant visualization of that data. So we'll try and post the link when we publish this video. And what you're saying there really ties into my final question, and it's a little bit of a science fiction angle. Let's jump to the cutting edge of science and the developments surrounding AI, machine learning, and natural language processing, which you mentioned. Surely these are a fertile area for the weaponization of technology, where malicious countries can deploy armies of bots, all which will pass the Turing test with flying colors, overwhelm any online debates conducted by real human beings. I also noticed that a couple of years ago, Vladimir Putin stated that the country that leads in AI development will be the ruler of the world. And honestly, nobody wants to see Russia win that race, but China is probably quite well positioned to lead or even win it. What are the implications?
I think that's definitely a future that I can see as well. I mean, I think I've explicitly warned about the kind of like the danger of us inching towards the Turing test, and yeah, the kind of how readily we're building technologies which allow machines to mimic human behavior. That's everything from Google and Apple's kind of virtual agents that they build that sit in our phones, all the way through to banks building kind of chatbots to allow us to do online banking, and fulfill customer services role. There is a huge push towards building that kind of technology, and I do think that the ability for there to be automated, or at least semi-automated kind of interaction pathways to be created definitely opens up all kinds of influence opportunities for those that wishing to pursue it, which aren't really available right now. I hammer on a lot about the importance of identity and belonging, and these kind of emotional substrate factors as being so important to why we do the things that we do and how we're influenced. Well, that's exactly the kind of thing that those kind of virtual agents would be able to inspire and create, friendship, as much as kind of broadcasting disinformation on Twitter, actually drawing people into longer term, more meaningful relationships. And of course, one of the things that influence operators will need to do to do that will be to scale them. And the use of natural language processing to scale that kind of activity is definitely a fear. I don't know what we do about that, to be honest with you. But that I alluded slightly earlier. And sorry, this isn't going to kind of a very solutions-oriented way of finishing this. I alluded earlier to the idea that there are certain technology development trajectories which imply that the problem is going to get worse rather than better, and I think this is certainly one of them.
And to an extent, to extrapolate from that, whereas now either chatbots or even trolls might engage you for a couple of lines or threads before jumping into their purpose, these automated human chatbots could potentially create a relationship with you over weeks or months of grooming before then starting to place their little their little hooks as well, little propaganda hooks. So that could be extremely insidious.
That's right. I agree.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been an extraordinary dive behind the front lines of the emerging information battlefield. It's been illuminating and yet thoroughly disturbing conversation. Thank you so much, Carl.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
And please do check out Carl's enlightened TED Talks on YouTube and his extraordinary book, The Death of Gods, The New Global Power Grab. Thank you.